So please join me now in extending a very warm welcome to Dr. Ena Jansen. Dr. Jansen, I'm now turning the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Tanya. Ja, omdat dit een open event is, werd ik gevraagd om toch in het Engels te praten. So, thank you for the organizers for the invitation to speak and to you for zooming in on this Sunday at 11 a.m. your time. I believe it is spring in Canada and hopefully a lovely day. And here where I am in Cape Town, it is 5 p.m. If I could have my computer here at the window, I could show you that Table Mountain is shimmering in the late afternoon autumn sun. Yes, as you know, I was supposed to speak at your conference in May 2020, but that countrywide trip, Mary and I were corresponding a lot about that, never took place, not in 2020, not in 21, and also not this year, to my great disappointment, I might add. So the theme of your Congress 2022 is transitions, and I will examine colonial and post-colonial power and racial dynamics through the lens of South African domestic workers in stories in which they are pivotal characters. I will consider whether a transition in the position and representation of domestic workers has taken place. And I make use of concepts such as entanglement, contact or border zone, the peripheral space of the backyard, and also of the term ignorance contract. So these words you will be hearing quite a few times during my lecture. But first, some background about the place and position I speak from. As you know, South Africa had its first democratic election in 1994, after many decades of apartheid government. Nelson Mandela was the first post-apartheid president, and Cyril Ramaphosa is the present one. The ANC has been governing the country for the past nearly 30 years, and in spite of many important changes, disappointment in the ANC-led government is widespread. I am, however, not going to speak about politics in general, nor about specific matters such as South Africa's high unemployment rate and corruption, however relevant they are to my subject. So allow me to briefly introduce myself and to declare, and that's important for a subject as this one, my own position as a privileged white person, someone who grew up in a family who had domestic workers. I am a literary scholar with great interest in history and sociology. I have worked as an academic, both in South Africa and the Netherlands, as Tanya has just said. And my inaugural lecture as Professor of South African Literature at the University of Amsterdam in 2003 was focused on stories about Krutua. And I'm going to show you a painting made by the South African artist Marlene Dumas, who lives in Amsterdam, about how she envisioned what Krutua could have looked like. And Krutua was an intriguing young Khoi girl who was the first nanny at the Cape, working for the family of the first Dutch governor, Jan van Riebeeck. The Cape, as you know, was a refreshment station for VOC ships en route to the east. And Krutua was, besides being a nanny, also an interpreter between van Riebeeck and her own Khoi people. Much has been written about this intriguing young woman by historians, by novelists, and other creative writers. And a few years after my Krutua lecture, during a visit back to South Africa in about 2008, I realized that actually every nanny and domestic worker is, like Krutua, an interpreter, a go-between figure, moving to and fro between the comfortable homes of employers and their own modest abodes. And in spite of their low status, they do have a degree of agency and power, precisely because of an intimate knowledge of their employers' homes and because they know very well just how dependent employers are on their caring skills. On the whole, however, they are very vulnerable because they are often badly paid and they need the work in a country where close on 40% of its people are unemployed. So my insight into the Krutua-like go-between role of domestic workers got me started on a project which combines social history and literary analysis. And I was inspired by Alison Light's brilliant book, and I'll show you the cover of this one also, Mrs. Woolf, that's Virginia Woolf, and the Servants, the Hidden Heart of Domestic Service. And I realized that this was the kind of book which had to be written about the representation of South African domestic workers, but then in a wider perspective than looking at the work of just one author. And of course, it would be much more about race than class. And I therefore began reading widely in the South African fiction archive with the specific aim of searching for women with maids' caps who might otherwise disappear out of the back door of our collective memory and literary history, if they did not become the very specific focus of literary research. And then my research, it took quite a few years, was like working on an archaeological dig, searching for layers of intercultural contacts and for fragments of life stories which could perhaps show how South Africa got itself into the state it has been in for the greater part of 4 centuries, a very contested society. And colonialism and slavery are unquestionably reasons for the skew, unfair, and distorted society the country developed into right from the start of the intermingling of the Dutch and local communities. Black people's ability to sustain their pastoral lifestyle in rural areas was especially undermined as a result of the discovery of gold in 1886. And furthermore, after the Union of South Africa was formed in 1910. And the proclamation of the Natives Land Act in 1913, in fact, legalized land grabbing by white people. The labor of Black people was then desperately needed, and new tax laws forced them into the cash system of mining bosses and landlords. At first, it was only Black men who flocked to the cities, entering spaces that both resented them and needed them and their labor. Their presence was regulated by strict pass laws. In my research, I, however, focus, of course, on how and why women also left rural areas to become migrant workers. For many years, their movements were not restricted by pass laws. Nobody took these women very seriously, actually. But between 1955 and 1985, pass laws also regulated their presence in the cities. And the only work most of them could do and had to be taught that was domestic work. And even now in post-apartheid South Africa, more than 1 million Black South African women remain still in domestic work. This work is, of course, important, and there is no shame in doing it, on the condition that it is rewarded with a fair wage and with respect. These nannies, housekeepers, and chars occupy a central place in South African communities, but it is an ambivalent position. They are precariously situated between urban and rural areas, between rich and poor, white and black, and they are at once intimately connected to and at a distant remove from the families they serve. And all across the world, and very often in apartheid and post-apartheid South Africa, female domestic workers are described as part of the family. These women are without a doubt the most important contact figures in South Africa between white and black. And although kitchens and backyards in white homes can therefore be described as contact zones, in the sense meant by Mary Louise Pratt, a linguist some of you might know, when she coined the term to refer to the so-called meet, clash, and grapple contacts between people from hugely different cultural backgrounds. My contention is that her term contact zone is ultimately too neutral. The ambivalence of the relationship between maids and madams, especially where nannies and children are concerned, always makes for intricate negotiations. And after researching a large part of South African history and exploring the literary archive, I came to the conclusion that the ongoing negotiations between domestic workers and employers require comparisons rather to a frontier or a border zone. So for my project, I analyzed more than 50 South African novels written by both white and black authors. I also made use of memoirs and the occasional interview, for example, with Cecilia Magadlela, who had worked for me in Johannesburg for many years. And authors, some of whose work you might have read, include J.M. Coetzee, Nadine Gordimer, both two South African Nobel Prize winners, Elsa Joubert, I'll talk more about her just now, Sindiwe Magona, and Sisonke Misamang. I don't know whether you perhaps know of her. Which way should I show? Sisonke Misamang lived in Canada as part of her childhood spent in exile. And these authors, in their writings, I uncovered often wry and subversive insights into this madam-maid nexus, capturing paradoxes relating to shifting power relationships. And this research, as Tanya has said, resulted in 3 books in 3 languages. The Afrikaans Swiss Familie, this one, the Dutch Bijna Familie. They all have the same cover, and the English book like Family. This last one was published as a hard copy by Wits University Press and online by Cambridge University Press. And the titles of my books, as you saw, all contain the word family, but also the word like. Anyone with a full-time or part-time domestic worker, especially if she is live-in, know that both intimacy and distance lie at the basis of this very entangled relationship. People will recognize aspects of what I call the like family relationship. The emphasis is, of course, on the word like. These women are sometimes like, but they are not daughters or mothers of their employers. They are like, but not real family of the families for whom they work. And my 3 books overlap, but are also very different because of their intended audiences who have different backgrounds and reading experiences. And having lived both in South Africa and the Netherlands, I have, I could say firsthand knowledge of what is often called the servant situation in these two countries. However, I know nothing of the situation in Canada, and I needed to get some idea of what your experiences and possible expectations of my lecture might be. If I had traveled there, I would have stayed with many of you and I might have witnessed something of the situation, but I went into websites such as that of the Canadian Encyclopedia, and I discovered, that was my impression, that South Africa and Canada have more in common than I had realized, because both countries have a history of slavery, which was abolished in the same year, 1834. And in both our countries, issues of gender, migrancy, and race impact on attitudes to domestic work. And these factors have given rise to the many stereotypes surrounding domestic workers. And I believe these workers are often called caregivers in Canada. I'm not sure, but that's what I've been reading, a term which in South Africa is reserved actually for women taking care of the elderly. I have a friend who lives in Toronto, and she describes her caregiver as like a sister, a comparison also very often made by South African employers. And listening to a CBC podcast, Nannies, The Secret Life of Canada, I realized that also in Canada, kids are often looked after by women of color. During the Q&A, I would like to hear more. And the podcast makers point out that first people, women, and especially migrant women, take on this job. How did this happen? I saw that it in the beginning was a class thing. Mostly recently immigrated British, Irish, and Finnish women apparently did this work. And after World War II, recruitment programs were specifically aimed by the Canadian government to get West Indian women to Canada. And then during the 80s and 90s, approximately 30,000 Filipino women were encouraged to immigrate to do domestic work. And this meant that during the last 30 to 50 years, caring work has become, as in South Africa, much more racialized than it was a century ago. It's the same in Holland. Many people who go there often will have noticed that it is not anymore the Dutch werkster who it's a Turkish woman, a Colombian woman. It's also become much more further afield that domestic workers are coming to work. What further struck me was that Canadians also have experience of stringent laws which determined the movements of domestic workers who migrated. And I believe that women who migrate to Canada under caregiver programs are required to complete 24 months of full-time work and working for one particular employer before they can start a process of applying for resident status. During these 2 years, their work permit therefore ties them down to how one employer would have the relationship with them. They are not anymore required to live in a situation which made them much more vulnerable during previous decades. Okay, I don't have to tell you about the situation in your own country, but I know there are other people logged in today. And what it comes down to is that it seems to me that Canadians are also no strangers to the often stigmatized, isolated, and exploitable aspects of domestic labor. And with this in mind, I therefore presume that you have insight into what I have already earlier on called the border zone of domestic service. So after slavery was abolished, the dual legacy of colonialism and apartheid in South Africa means that its society and its literature is the site of complicated tensions. A book written by South African sociologist Jacqueline Koch in 1980 is to this day of the utmost importance. Its title is Maids and Madams, a study in the politics of exploitation. It's a very important book. She decades ago already warned that what were then the legal and social divisions between Black and white in South Africa reinforce the power of the employer and weaken the position of the employee. And this division is still true in post-apartheid South Africa. Although there now is a fixed minimum wage, as well as unions who act on their behalf, these workers are still very vulnerable. They may have the power to vote, and our president and government ministers are Black people like themselves, but they themselves are still very far removed from any nexus of power. And in my work, I therefore approach domestic servants as links between different worlds. And during apartheid, they were practically the only Black people living in white suburbs. Nannies were the only Black people allowed, for example, onto whites-only beaches. I have here, it's the cover of the Gids. There's a photograph of my sister and myself, one of twins, on the beach with our nanny. It must have been in the late 1950s. And this go-between position between races and classes, between tradition and modernity, can of course be analyzed by making use of insights from urban migration and labor studies, which I also did, but also, as I show in my book, Like Family, by analyzing literary texts, where they are sometimes just briefly present or sometimes in the center of a text. Yes, because I am a participant in the Netherlandic section of this conference, I want to start my discussion of literary text by referring to a book by a well-known Dutch author, Adriaan van Dis. In Het Beloofde Land, he describes his trip to Cape Town shortly after the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990. He stays with an old friend, Eva, before they will later set off on a road trip to the Karoo, the heart of the country where his friend hails from. It's a white friend who he met her in Holland when she was also studying there. One morning, while the domestic worker, Sophie, is scrubbing the floor on all fours, he strikes up a conversation with her. And he is amazed by how intimately Black and white lives are interwoven through the institution of domestic work. Sophie says of her employer, Eva is a very good white. Ze is als een moeder voor me. Zonder haar had ik geen huis. Eva is like a mother to me. Without her, I would not have a house. And when Adriaan and Eva arrive back in Cape Town, they are welcomed home by Sophie, who has been staying in Eva's house, looking after her cat and everything else. And the warmth between Eva and Sophie is tangible, but also the realization that Sophie will, within the next hour, be expected to leave, to return to her own small house in the township. The outsider van Dis is struck by the afstand in verbintenis between the women, by their closeness, but also, despite calling each other mom, the normality of the distance between them. So what I want to emphasize by this example is that an outsider like Van Dis immediately notices the close relationship between the employer and her maid, that he is astounded by both the loving interdependency and the practical reality of their very different positions in life. And in the Dutch version of my book, Bijna Familie, I added specifically a chapter in which I discuss books by Dutch journalists about their experiences in post-apartheid South Africa. And all of them were, before going to South Africa, convinced that they would not employ a domestic worker. But all of them eventually succumb to the South African way of life. And all of them experience and describe the servant situation as the crux of the complicated race relations in the country. So with all of this in mind, I consider the servants as pivotal characters at the intersection between the categories of race, gender, class, and place. And many of you might also use the concept of Stuart Hall about the circuit of culture, which explains representation through literature, also art, theatre, film, is as central to processes whereby meaning and identities in society are both constructed and reproduced. The people do what they read often in or see in films. And I see, therefore, literary texts as the outcome of a system of statements that give shape to what can and what cannot be said. So, without a doubt, the most famous South African novel about a Black woman is The Long Journey of Poppy Nongena, originally published in Afrikaans as Die Swerfjare van Poppy Nongena. When Poppy's husband dies, she is subject to rulings of the Urban Areas Act, which determine that Poppy is banished to his impoverished Eastern Cape homeland, a place she has never even visited before. But she goes back to Cape Town because she desperately needs money. She leaves her children behind, and quite by chance, she finds work in the house of a Mrs. Statler, a housewife who is in fact the well-known author Elsa Joubert. And when riots break out in the township where she is hiding out at night, Poppy flees to Joubert's house on Christmas Day 1976. And Joubert realizes that Poppy's story could be a vehicle for writing about the cruelties of the apartheid system in a very direct way. And she starts interviewing Poppy. She tells her life story to Joubert, starting with that of her grandmother. So it's a big, big life story. And in Joubert's moving orchestration of these oral history interviews, Poppy is given a highly audible voice through the novelist's sophisticated and unmistakable mediation. The novel had a huge impact in South Africa. Somebody like historian Herman Gilume even thinks that it paved the way for whites to accept the inevitability of an end to apartheid a decade later. Every family had a Poppy in the kitchen, which made them realize just how wickedly unfair the system of apartheid was that they had always been voting for. So this book, Poppy Nongena, is a very important text in South Africa. Poppy's powerlessness and dependence on the power of passbook administrators, but also on the power of a white woman employer, is stressed in both the novel and the excellent film, which was based on it 40 years later in 2020. And both the novel and the film actively alert white readers and viewers' awareness of their culpability and responsibility. And both the novel and the film opened up furious discussions about the pertinent right of the pertinent question of the right of white authors and directors to represent Black characters, to tell their stories. I think many of you will know Catherine Stockett's novel, The Help, which extensively explores the stories of maids in white Mississippi households. And you will remember how one of the characters accused Catherine Stockett of stealing her story, saying that the author had dipped her pen in someone else's blood. Yeah, so this is the whole problem of cultural appropriation, which I also discuss in my book. And yeah, how should this story of oppressed people and wrongdoings be represented? And also, yeah, a lot can be said about that. Many people think, for example, the Nobel Prize winner Nadine Gordimer and Marlene van Niekerk, who found that white authors should not focus on and try and represent Black women, but they must scrupulously interrogate whiteness. Yeah, it's a very complicated question, which is also important in the history of art. And someone like the art historian Marian Arnold, in her thought-provoking article, Portraits of Servitude, describes works portraying women in service as some of the most problematic visual images in South African art. Yeah, and it's also something which in my book, I've got a whole section which, where must I go, which looks at images of Black women. Yeah, here's a painting by Marlene Dumas, and yeah, it is a very pertinent question how to represent and to not reinforce stereotypes, but to yeah, I could also talk a lot about, for example, the painting of Annie Mavata, which was done by Dorothy Kay, and there's a, yeah, it's too lengthy to really go into this at the moment, but very important it is to would these images ask questions, or would they just reconfirm stereotypes? And this ties in with Tamara Scheffer's reminder in her article, Fraught Tenderness, that the maid-madam relationship is a troubling relationship and that it needs to be represented as troubled. And with this in mind, I want to focus on a few stories in the liminal space where employer and domestic worker are most likely to have contact. And besides the kitchen, such a space is the backyard of a typical South African house. And I suppose this backyard can best be compared to the sort of pre-interbellum spatial and societal divide in British society, something which is very kept still very much alive in modern day period films such as Downton Abbey, that of the vertical divide between the upstairs and the downstairs. Thanks to the climate in South Africa, this space is more an outdoor kind of horizontal divide. The backyard is usually within direct sight from the kitchen door of the main house, and somewhere further up, often behind the garage, is the maid's room. The word backyard or agterplaas in Afrikaans stresses its most distinct feature. It's at the back, out of sight from the front, where civil appearances and decorum are important middle-class values. Well, many South African children often very fondly remember the warmth they experienced in the maid's room, the comforting smells of soap and porridge, memories South African people have of apartheid very often are based on their memories of the nanny, and they are steeped in emotion, especially love and guilt. She is often remembered nostalgically as a source of comfort and care. And but if you read Black authors, somebody like Eskia Pahlaule, he remembers the backyards of the houses in Pretoria where his mother worked as a traumatic space where white children even tossed an orange at him as though he was an animal, not giving it in his hand. And although his mother was their loving nanny and a source of comfort to the white city children, they must have been taught in some way or other to fear and to resent all other Black people, however small. And there are many texts in which backyards play an important role, but I briefly want to reflect on two of them. The one is the short story Agterplaas, also written by Elsa Joubert. Here is a photograph of her written in a book which she published just shortly before her death. She died during COVID, of COVID, at the age of 95, I think she was. But she wrote a very important story, Agterplaas. The other text I will speak about will be by Antjie Krog. And both these texts are presented as works of fiction, but both have a strong autobiographical ring to them. And at the time of publication of their texts, both Elsa Joubert and Antjie Krog were living in the affluent suburb Oranjezicht, high against the slopes of Table Mountain, very close by here. Both of the white protagonists in the texts are tormented by the discrepancy between their own lives and those of their domestic workers. And both texts explicitly interrogate the figure of the servant, who takes us into history, but also into ourselves. And that's important, how confrontational often these texts are. And both white women are very conscious of their inability to really communicate with a Black woman. Joubert's worker is a live-in servant. That of Krog's commutes from a township outside Cape Town. Both Black women who work for them have strong ties with the poor rural Eastern Cape, an area where the previous so-called homelands were during apartheid times. Still backward, and actually the fact that both these workers refer and have these ties to the Eastern Cape just shows how little has actually changed for many people in the country. Okay, briefly, Joubert's story Agterplaas. There's a new domestic worker. She moves into the servant's room, and the first person narrator realizes that the Black woman could be a bridge to a world unknown to her, but she finds it impossible to bridge the gap, describing herself as literally living on the periphery of a world she will never know. And she is fascinated by what goes on in the maid's room. And she often stands in the garden close by for longer than she needs be to water the plants, because of the conventions and the laws prohibiting social interaction between races. She does not dare enter the room. That's one of the things that one must remember. The domestic worker comes into her house all the time, but she does not go into her space. And she hears it's a sort of taboo space in which she hears desperate conversations. There are people visiting Flora, whose life is described as multiple, related to that of many others, an amorphous body which invades my own. And the missus meets some of these people who come and ask for her help, for example, to write petitions or to write requests for pass law reasons. But there's even a baby born in this backyard. But both Flora and the young mother disappear from the room after Elsa returns from a week's holiday. So that's very typical, that Flora actually knows that her madam, however much she had promised that she would chase away inspectors should they come and ask how many people are in her yard, Flora knows that her madam does not have any real power to protect her. The other text about a backyard comes from a volume of poetry by a very well-known South African writer, Antjie Krog. And it's, I think this is a photograph of Antjie Krog. She travels widely, has written very important works. And she has written a series of poems. She's actually more well known for her poetry, although the book Country of My Skull was published all over the world. And her series of poems called Bediende Praatjies, Servants Talk, was published 35 years after Joubert's short story. And Krog unflinchingly explores the entangled relationship between a white Cape Town couple and their black domestic worker, Victoria, in post-apartheid South Africa. And in spite of monumental political transitions due to the official ending of apartheid in 1994, many more black people are now unemployed, and many are still desperately poor. And whites have moved, yes, from to the political periphery, but they are still mostly at the economic center. I have in the last chapter of my book quite an extensive comparison between these texts. At Krog's house, there is no back room. No servants' room. The backyard is small and called a courtyard. And it is, again, a border zone where desperate negotiations often take place. And Krog unflinchingly explores the entangled relationship between her and her husband and their domestic worker. And in keeping with a long tradition of works in which domestic worker characters feature, for example, let's see, James Coetzee's book, Age of Iron, is an important intertext. The organization of the old and the new South African world is interrogated. And we see that Victoria, actually, her name, of course, is quite interesting. Victoria relies on the guilty feelings of her employers, and she uses her knowledge of their shame and about apartheid to, as is said, to continuously just shake the white people tree and watch the money falling. And readers realize that Victoria's extended rural family survives thanks to what she can wrangle out of her employers to supplement their government pensions and child support grants. What we see is that Krog feels just as powerless as Joubert in her efforts to alleviate the needs of a domestic worker. And she resents the fact that Victoria needs her help in spite of all the political changes. To round off, I see the time is running out. The lives of practically all South Africans have been touched by the institution of paid domestic work. That one can easily say, if your mother wasn't a domestic worker away from your family, you had one in your family. So white people often grew up with two mothers and black people with no mother at home. And one wonders, how is it possible that apartheid and these very unfair domestic arrangements have been going on for decades and decades? And many books have been written trying to explain both the disaster of apartheid and the failings of the transition into a new South Africa. And a pertinent question is why apartheid was endorsed for so long and why many aspects of it are still being perpetrated. And I find it a very interesting concept. The so-called ignorance contract offers some explanation. By making use of material in the Apartheid Archives project in Johannesburg, a woman called Melissa Steyn, author of a book, Whiteness Just Isn't What It Used to Be, White Identity in a Changing South Africa, explores how the tacit agreement to entertain ignorance lies at the heart of a society structured in racial hierarchy. And she makes it very clear that the system of racial apartheid could not have been functional or legally sustained for so many decades without the active and passive cooperation of the whole white population. All participated in discourses that justified the status quo. Their apparent ignorance of gross injustices is explained by Steyn as to be a social achievement with strategic value. That's important. Both white and black people were part of this ignorance contract. Whites out of arrogance and blacks to shield and protect themselves. So this is a deduction Melissa Steyn makes from studying many memories of apartheid. And I strongly feel that the literary archive, which I have used for my book Like Family, strongly supplements the Apartheid Archive project. Literature is another repository of very important knowledge about the workings of apartheid. It shows just how callously structural entitlements were taken for granted by privileged whites at the expense of racialized others. And of course, not only South African society is structured in maintaining racial hierarchy, it is a global phenomenon. The exclusive world of white privilege exists in a parallel universe to the degradation it creates. And my conclusion, therefore, is that all of us, whether in South Africa or in Canada, are part of a greater world where power is unequally and unfairly distributed, and that we all need to understand this, to imagine this, and to stop perpetuating our roles in the scheme of ignorance contracts. As prominent post-colonial thinker Achille Mbembe puts it, what is needed among white people, and for that matter, among all those privileged also in the Far East and the Middle East, is a politics of responsibility, which would include bearing a material responsibility to undo the ravages of colonialism and apartheid. We all need to listen to the pain of others, to read books in which dilemmas of inequality are teased out. We need to do what we can in the border zones of our everyday, to share and to pay respect, to act. Transition starts at home, in the interaction between employers and their carers, their domestic workers and nannies. I thank you.